Hello and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. So here we are, start of season 5. Yes, really, season 5. Bridge and I are going to be taking a bit of a trip down memory lane to begin with, taking a little revisit to some of our earlier episodes, and in doing so, giving some reflections on what strikes us now. What have we learned and continue to learn? What are the threads we forgot to unravel? So please, come and join us for some episodes on being reflective. I've gone right back to the very beginning and taken a listen to Being in the Conversation, our very first episode. Anyone remember that one? I certainly do. Forevermore to be known as the episode we did twice. The second time we even recorded it. Listening back now, I'm struck by just how much we packed in. It's like we threw the kitchen sink at every leadership topic you could possibly imagine. Storytelling, vulnerability, inclusivity, burnout, meetings, you name it, it was probably in there. But honestly, that first episode feels like a time capsule to me. It was raw, it was real, and maybe a bit all over the place, but it's also where we started. I love that, where we started from. And as messy as it might have been or felt as I listened to it, I was smiling all the way through because it did lay the foundation for everything that's followed. So without trying to ramble too much, let me see if I can pick out some of my top reflections from this episode. So the first one I've got is actually finding our voice. What really jumps out to me as I listen now is how much we were still figuring things out. Our voice, our message, our why. We were trying to answer the big questions. Can we actually do this? Do we have anything meaningful to say? Will anyone actually even listen? And you know what? We didn't have all the answers back then, and we still don't. But what we did have was a commitment to be human, unapologetically us, and to create a space where we could sit with each other's experiences without comparison or judgment. That was quite tricky first time around when I'm sat with somebody so awesome as Bridge, but there we go. Looking back, that's what makes me most proud of this episode. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. And it was honest. And right from those early natterings, we've stayed true to this throughout for another 50 plus episodes now. So the second thing was about communication and connection, because this episode was actually called Being in the Conversation. So thankfully we did spend a good time talking about that, and not just about speaking, but also the art of being understood. You might remember, or if you're listening to this for the first time, a spoiler alert, the quote at the end by George Bernard Shaw was, "The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it's taking place." That line still hits home. As leaders, how often do we assume that we've been clear only to realise that our message was muddled? And listening to this episode reminded me that leadership isn't just about having all the answers. It's about the right questions and taking responsibility for when we're clear. Back then, we were figuring out what that looked like in practice, tailoring messages, creating inclusive space, and making everyone feel heard. And those lessons are still just as relevant now. And I love the fact that from those early days, we've found so many avenues to have others being in the conversation. Guests to lead topics, our listeners as guests to give feedback and ideas on what has been and what next. And one of the greatest joys is hearing from those listening that they would love to pull up a chair and come and join in our conversation. I love that. Third thing, vulnerability. This is what really struck me. How quickly we became willing to talk about vulnerability, about owning our mistakes, reflecting on our behaviour, and taking responsibility when we fell short or fall short. In this episode, we talked about the episode we hold up to ourselves, the way things we judge in others often reflect what we're struggling with for ourselves. That's a tough lesson, but such an important one. And hearing those words again now reminds me once again that what Bridge and I are after is embracing all parts of ourselves, the messy, imperfect ones included, to create space for others to do the same. And I think that that's what leadership is so often about. What's different between then and now for this podcast? Well, I guess in that first episode with its exceptionally broad title, it felt a bit like we're throwing ideas into the wind and just hoping something would stick. I'd like to tell you now that we're more focused, have more of a plan, but I don't want to get carried away. We've definitely grown, we're definitely learning and continue to learn, and we haven't got it all figured out. So it's probably best to say we continue to evolve. The podcast is something we love doing. We're very committed to More Than a Lumpy Jumper and making space in our lives for it. Episodes have changed shape and delivery, like right now with these reflection episodes, to allow Bridge and I to continue with life and leadership as well as talking about it. And it's funny. In this episode, we talked about the ripple effect, how small changes can create big waves. And looking back now, that's so true. That one episode was like dropping that pebble in the water. It set off ripples that have shaped this podcast, our conversations, and maybe even a little bit into our lives. Who would have known back then that my brand would now include me as the chief ripple maker? So, why did I decide to revisit this episode? I think it's because I like being reminded where we started from and how far we've come. How often do we do that for ourselves? It's a reminder that leadership, like life, is a path to travel. See, I didn't use the word journey then. Path to travel is what I'm using. It's about trying, stumbling, learning, and growing. And as we keep moving forward, I want to hold on to these lessons from that first episode into what I'm doing for myself, what Bridge and I are doing for the podcast when we will be back together again in a few weeks' time. We want to make sure that we are communicating with clarity and intention, leading with vulnerability and reflection, and above all, being unapologetically ourselves so that others can be unapologetically themselves too. So if you're listening to this for the first time, or indeed a second time, third time, or whatever it might be, and thinking, I'm not there yet, that's okay. Because neither am I, neither's Bridge, none of us are. We're all just figuring it out as we go along, and go we will.
Hi, and welcome to More Than a Lumpy Jumper with Bobby and Bridge, having a conversation about leadership, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Bobby and I have known each other for how many years?
32 years, I think.
Oh, that's scary. 32 years of knowing each other and being friends. We have some similar experiences and also some very different experiences. And really, we're just going to have a conversation about those experiences and how they reflect on leadership, various topics about leadership, really with a view to helping humanize the discussion about leadership. I think one of the things that certainly I've experienced has been when I've been looking at leadership as a concept, lots of really interesting books and articles, but sometimes they just make you feel a little bit inadequate and haven't really reflected the experiences of the humanity of being a leader. So, Bobby, I'm going to put you on the stand.
Yeah. I think the thing to say about we're going to be having conversations about topics, tried this a bit already. Us trying to stick to a topic is impossible. So, anyone listening to this podcast, just be aware that we could meander, but we'll try and bring it back to where we actually started from. But we'll just see how that goes. I think the other thing that we said we were going to talk about as well is why have we called ourselves More Than a Lumpy Jumper? So this 32 years of knowing this gorgeous creature started when we were in the military together. And female officers, soldiers were actually referred to as lumpy jumpers. Everyone can take a sharp intake of breath about it.
Me too.
Completely bizarre at the time because I didn't even have knockers when I was in the army. It wasn't until I actually had my daughter that I actually think, right, now you could call me a lumpy jumper if you really wanted to. Not that I want to be called a lumpy jumper, but that's where it stems from. But this whole element about us being more than a lumpy jumper, yes, we are. And as those 32 years have gone on, what we have experienced is what we're going to talk about. So as far as who I am, so yes, I did 9-10 years in the army, in the Royal Signals. I've then had a long career working in corporate organisations, a mixture of industries and sectors. But I think the bit that I bring is about that, but more so about my self-development. It's almost like a game of two halves. And of course, it hasn't really been like that, but my leadership style hasn't always been the way that it is now. But I got into my 40s and decided to accredit as a coach, which means that I had to do an awful lot of my own self-development. And lots of things came to light about how I viewed myself, how I had been living, the type of life I've been living. And actually has supported me in harnessing my own power and standing in my own ground and taking a stand for particular things and being much more comfortable about being me, all the shitty stuff as well as all of the good stuff, but very much more accepting that you can't put bits and pieces of yourself in a box and hope that it's going to go away. And I think that's some of the conversation we're going to get into with the way that that shows up when people tell you that you shouldn't be like this or you shouldn't be like that or should be more like this. When in fact, I probably will now not use the phrase, what you see is what you get, but I am unapologetically me, the sorry, not sorry stand with what I'm now doing as a coach. So I now consult and coach, and I'm very committed to supporting people, both who are already leaders or who are on their way to being leaders, being unapologetically themselves too.
Yay. It's reminding me of something I saw on Netflix yesterday. Empowered women empower women. It's really difficult to empower women if the women who are working with them are not already empowered.
Yeah.
So I love that you've come into your power and accepting your power. So I'm Bridge Forster. As Bobby said, we met walking up the steps of Sandhurst Royal Military Academy as a group of women who were the first women joining the military proper as in their own right, rather than being part of the Women's Royal Army Corps. And I don't know that we ever saw ourselves as trailblazers at the time. I think we were just sort of muddling through as best as we could. But as I've grown older, I look back, and when I talk about the things that Bobby and I have experienced and that I've experienced in other roles, it has become apparent that people do view the things that we've done as trailblazers, as opening doors for women, empowered women, empowering women. After the military, I became a barrister for about 10, 12 years, and then left to join the United Nations, working in humanitarian demining and clearance of unexploded ordnance. I trained as a bomb disposal officer and was the country director in Palestine for the United Nations, overseeing that type of work. I've worked in very male-dominated sectors and have often been the only woman at the table. And so I've become very aware of the need for women's representation, women's voices, but also the representation of other underrepresented people. But also, I think that one of the things we're going to be discussing is just so that men don't feel that this is going to be a sort of crazy feminazi rant. That I think both of us truly believe that if we can make the culture changes that are necessary to allow the space for female leaders to take their rightful place, this isn't just about benefiting women, that actually the culture changes that are needed benefit men and all the diversity that exists on this planet. So really that's where we're aiming to go.
Can I just say something? I do want to say, and this is something that I think when we talk about this benefiting everybody, that often it's very competitive.
Yes.
And the leadership piece is quite competitive. And what I would love to see more of is when people can really celebrate, welcome, and be in awe of the people they sit with. And I want to say for the record, that's how I feel about sat here with you. Whilst it gives me that whole, oh, Jesus, she's done such bigger things than I have because of the competitive bit that's in it. But equally, just loving the fact of quite what both of us are bringing to this party. And that if you can be in conversation with people like that and really be grateful for all that they bring and all of the experience that they actually have, it would make life a lot easier as a leader.
I completely agree with that one. Obviously, it's always lovely to hear nice things said about you, but the work that you've done on the self-development and the changes that are evident in a much more peaceful Bobby that I see before me than maybe the wild creature that I first met. A creature in the nicest possible way.
Yeah, but creature it was, yeah.
I also, the reason that I really wanted to work with you was that I hoped that you would bring that sort of maturity and thoughtfulness about being that I have often struggled with, still struggle with. And so I am also hoping to learn loads from the conversations that we have when you talk about the work that you've done, the work that you're doing, and some of the ways that you think about things or that we can reframe to help us be able to be, as you say, kinder and to celebrate each other more.
Yeah.
And after that love fest, we're going to start by talking about communication.
Yes.
Which we're doing now, right?
Yeah. I think I said to you when we were looking at this that communication is such an enormous topic. But one of the things being that our podcasts are about being in conversation, and communication is conversational. Also, the storytelling. We also talked about what non-violent communication actually looked like. I think that's one of the spaces that we wanted to be in. And I think we've just gone with kindness to begin with, that level of compassion. But if I go back for a minute to about power, we were talking earlier about what it used to be like to be in conversation with me that wasn't really like a conversation, as people would end up with a centre parting as I was railing about God knows what and saying an awful lot and really saying absolutely nothing. And what it's like to actually start to harness and balance out a bit in terms of what it is that you really want to say. And I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about in leadership was the conveying of the message, absolutely harnessing and being sure about your intention and what it is that you've actually got going on before you open your mouth, which actually makes it much easier for other people to hear what it is that you're trying to say.
Yeah, I think one of the great failures in leadership is communication. And if a leader communicates their wishes or their intentions or their objectives in a way that is not understood, that they're not going to get what they wanted. And then often there is a perception that that's some kind of failure on behalf of the people who are working for them. That, you're not performing, you're not doing, or you never do what you're asked. And actually, really, there's a need for the leader to first of all reflect, did I make it clear? And often, even before the making it clear, as you said, what exactly is it I need and want this person or this group to do? And how do I make sure that they understand that? Because communication, people talk about non-verbal communication, your body language and the language that you use. But actually, the whole point of communication is to be understood, to understand and to be understood. Because it's two-way, not one-way. And if we can't get the understanding piece, then everything else falls apart. And it's actually a really easy thing to fix in theory, not necessarily always in practice.
Yeah. Things that I'm thinking right now: ownership, taking responsibility, accountability, all sounds a little bit jargon-tastic. But I just remember all of those types of conversation that I have been in where managers, leaders will be conveying a message that says things like, the target we've got to hit is X, or the organisation has said that we've got to do such and such. I can come up with other examples, but both of those leaves them out. Because is that the message that they really want to be conveying? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, the target is the thing that's got to be hit, but what's the message? To actually talk about an organisation like you're not included in it. What is the message? So what does it actually mean for the team that you are working with? And we've been talking about knowing your people well. Yes. So the fact is that if you talk about this ethereal target, or the organisation has told us we've got to do X, Y, and Z, it takes absolutely no account for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in your team, 3 of whom might be introverts, 2 might be extroverts, the diversity of what that group actually looks like, the way that they like to be having messages conveyed. And if you can find ways of doing it coherently as a team, but for each individual, so that you know what to draw on to get the best out of them, that's taking full ownership of the message that you're conveying.
Yeah, I think that this idea of knowing your team and communicating with them what needs to be achieved, but how you think this person is going to do this, you're going to be like, let's have a discussion about how we're going to achieve that, rather than just throwing out a target and saying, off you go, get on with it, and then complaining when it doesn't get done. My first posting in the military, the colonel in charge of the regiment, he knew the name of every single soldier and officer who worked under him. He knew which of them had kids, the name of their kids, how many kids they had, the name of their wife, whether their wife had a job. He really knew as much as he possibly could. That's not an easy thing to do. That takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, but it was part of what was expected in the concept in the military of servant leadership, which is about the people, and that the people are your most important resource, and therefore you invest in them. Now, my experience in other organizations, particularly within the United Nations, unfortunately, has been that there is a real focus on the concept of leaders who have a vision and leaders who have a strategy to implement, but it completely ignores the people who are then responsible for delivering all of the aid and all of the targets, inverted commas, to the clients or the customers, who are some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And that, for me, is a missing piece. And it makes leadership very difficult if you don't have this understanding that you, as the leader, have a responsibility to understand, to get the best out of your people. It's not just ticking performance indicators, but it actually is going, as you said, the introverts need information in a particular way at a particular time. They need time to process. They might not want to speak out with their ideas, but yet their ideas are still important. So we get them in a different way. And I think we'd had a chat about how meetings are organised.
Yeah. So I think that we've got too much into a rut, and I use this in generalist terms because there'll be people going, no, we don't do it like that. And fair enough. But from my experience, it is all too easy, in particularly since we've been in lockdown and the nightmare that was COVID, that everything is a virtual team meeting, often without an agenda. And it's not always a case of that these conversations need to be in a meeting format or need to be formal. It may well be that you need to create a different environment for creativity, or actually we're just wanting to bounce some ideas around with this one, or we actually want to just talk about deadlines and targets. And so that you're very clear, even in that messaging, about what it is that you want the outcome of the meeting to be. But equally, I've been in situations where I'm saying to people, what do you actually want me there for? Because if you can't be clear about what the purpose is and be respectful of my time, I ain't showing up, which is a little bit petulant. And we'll talk about my level of petulance somewhere. Maybe it's petulant, or maybe it's been very clear about I'm doing, and again, this is about how I actually could come across. Let me do you a favour by asking you some questions. Do you need me for the whole hour? Or do you need me for 15 minutes? What is it that you actually want me to bring to the party? Or is it that you just want me to be receiving? So again, helping people to become clear about those sort of questions in the vain hope that they might start doing it for themselves. And then when you've got that layer, it's also about how do they do that with other people? Because you will have introverts there who won't be saying very much because they've been exhausted by actually being in a room or even virtually with a load of people. They'll want time to reflect on it. Have you given them the opportunity to reflect on it before they come to the meeting? There's all of that going on to actually make the most effective communication forum.
Yeah, and I think that there's also an element of timings of meetings as well.
Yes.
I am a great believer that there are far too many meetings. Most of the time, I think that you could get rid of about 80% of meetings and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference to the performance of an organisation, because there are other ways. But also having meetings at times that are not accessible to everyone and not recognising that people are not robots. People do bring stuff along with them because we're human, as do leaders. I am well aware that there are times when we bring our own personal issues to work, get out of bed the wrong way, or somebody had a row with your partner, or your dog's died, or you've got an ill kid. All of those things impact how much bandwidth we have available. And cramming meetings into the mix of people already trying to do a job, and meetings that are either not necessary or are disrespectful of people's times, are not the best way of communicating information. So I would use the example of meetings that are held late in the afternoon or at a time where many parents, and I won't say women because men are parents too, when parents might need to pick up their kids early in the morning. So the flexibility, or the idea that a recognition that everybody also has a life, and that this idea that, oh, we're all a family in this organisation, which is usually for me toxic speak for you're going to do extra work unpaid. Yeah, you're going to put up with, you're not allowed to set any boundaries, or any boundaries, and we're going to guilt you into pushing back on.
Could be very triggering for some people with some people's families as well. It's the last thing that they actually want to be correlated with.
I'm going to work to get away from my family.
I'm not suggesting that was my family, by the way, family, if you're listening to this. But yeah.
Good Lord. Sorry, Mum, not you. I have a bugbear about meetings, really. And I don't think that they are necessarily the best way to communicate.
Can I just go back a bit as well? Because you were talking about people being the most valuable asset. Oh, God, how many companies have I been in that have used that, trotted it out as part and parcel of whatever they've put on their website or what have you. Actions speak louder than words.
Well, yeah.
And I know that you're looking at working now in cultural transformation, and that's some of the stuff that I bring to the party now as well with consultancy and coaching. But that whole element where so often, and I do get it because I've been in the fray of that as the leader, where you are trying to please or indeed appease your customers. Because I've been in organisations where what the customers are having to buy is a grudge purchase, like a membership or whatever it might be, but also assuring and appeasing any form of governance structure. And you put those two pressures together, like the higher bit and then the people on the receiving end, that doesn't leave a lot of bandwidth, a lot of time for the people. And yet it is them that are going to support you in assuring the governance and going to support you. And if you treat them badly, neither end is going to get the best piece. It seems so bloody obvious when I say it like that, and yet I have seen it go really, really well and really, really wrong.
I've always viewed one of my roles as a leader is to protect the people that work for me to an extent, be the top cover for some of the crazier elements of governance or the headquarters, bright ideas factory, to push back, even though it can be, I think, what was the word we were describing it, career limiting?
Yes.
That is our
job.
duty. It's what we're there for. In my experience in many places, I'm sure the same for you, that's not how a leader views their role. It's about them and about their success and about their promotion, rather than thinking about how they can create the best environment for the people who work for them to thrive, to develop, to blossom into the best that they can be with all of their wonderful traits and their quirks and their brilliant ideas. And I think that reminded me of something we were talking about yesterday when we were talking about at Sandhurst. One of the things that they do is this breaking down of the personality and identifying the traits that are not to be taken forward. And I've always felt, I don't think I realised it at the time, but in hindsight, I think that is not the best way to manage. But also, it's not real, it's not possible to just, we'll just take that little bit out and get rid of it. Because most traits have a spectrum, and there's an element that is maybe not as useful or beneficial, but usually there's another element, another part of the spectrum where it is effectively a superpower. And that brings me back to the petulance. I don't think I ever viewed you as petulant. I always viewed you as having this superpower, which was a bit like a dog with a bone. If you thought something was wrong or you felt something needed saying, you would say it.
That's why I've been in trouble all my life. But I own it now. This is the thing. If I think about my coaching and my development, my contradiction right from very early childhood was my dad, bless him, wanting to make me an independent woman, but one that was seen and not heard. So it only went so far, and then it would be like, no, that's enough. And to be fair, I think with Sandhurst trying to work out what the hell they were doing with these, dare I say it, not for all of them, if any of you are listening, ladies, but some of us included, feral ladies or feral girls that had turned up, all a bit feisty, saying stuff and all the rest of it, and they weren't quite used to that. That again, it got clamped down on, which is when you get into this right and wrong behaviour, right and wrong traits. And my coaching is very much about owning it all, because it all still exists. It lives in us. It's in our tissues, what our family life was like, the institutions that we've been in, the societies that we've lived in, the environment we actually come from, and then the work environment. And that there needs to be acceptance, one not being worse than the other, good, bad, right, wrong, light, dark, whatever it might be, that actually it's all right. So my petulance can be petulant. I can be a frigging nightmare in terms of when I've just decided that I'm going to just be completely arsey. I am incredibly good at that. But when I've actually got it, it can be an overplayed strength. But what it is passion. I want to make a stand for the people that I work for and with. I want things to be right. I want things to be good for people in organisations. I feel very passionate about all of that. And I've done that organisationally. Now, if I need to do it one person at a time and creating that ripple effect, but it is a case of that I never want people to feel shame for the way they are. That unapologetically me actually comes with all of those bits that aren't quite so nice when perceived.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to shut them in a box. You try to do that and it will come out even more like an explosion.
I really like that, because I know we were talking a little bit earlier about we're human and we make mistakes, and we're not always the perfect leader, this person on a pedestal who knows everything and always has the right things to do and say. There have been plenty of times where, and particularly when I was going through the menopause, because we're both postmenopausal ladies, we have experienced our own personal summers that come at the most inopportune times.
Bikram Bob.
It always would happen when I'm about to engage in a really politically sensitive discussion with men who are parts of armed groups or non-governmental aligned armed groups who aren't very happy about there being a woman there talking to them at all in the first place, is exactly the time when you suddenly start to sweat,
get wet,
and get itchy, and your brain just turns to cotton wool. Yeah, so I've experienced that. And if you're going through that additional stress, then there are days when you just don't have time for people's shit. I don't want to coach you through this. Get on with your job. And of course, my reaction to that afterwards is shame. I feel guilty. And I didn't really see that sort of self-reflection and beating yourself up with my male colleagues and maybe, of course, we don't show everything that's going on, but I never saw that sort of questioning of themselves in that way that crippled me to an extent. I loved the fact we were talking about when we get cranky, that one of the things we tend to do or should be doing is apologize.
Yeah, I agree. And whether it's about apology or back to that word of owning and taking responsibility for, I had a boss once who would absolutely tear a strip off somebody. And although they never said this to me, I heard this third hand that they would say, look, I can do that to somebody. I can be really horrible and I can compartmentalize that and just put it over there because once I've done it, it's gone. I'm like, no, it hasn't. I can assure you it hasn't. I could stew on it for the next 25 years. And it takes me a little bit longer to get rid of it. So, 25 years is not good. 25 minutes and maybe I should do the same. But there was never an apology, or infrequently, for that sort of behaviours. Whereas I have learnt when I'm actually in that mode, more so recently than I think than in the past, of going, do you know what? For your own safety, it might be better that unless the world is on fire, you don't call me today. I actually just need a bit of space. I need some breathing space. I'm doing this to look after myself and actually to look after you. In actual fact, actually articulating it often made me feel better. And I would then not need the whole day, but maybe just a couple of hours. Or if I have been really scratchy, owning it and going, I'm sorry, I know I blew up. You don't need to know the reasons why. I'm just in a bad mood, but I should not have taken it out on you. It's mine. Probably the person I'm worst at doing that with is my husband.
But is he listening outside the door?
Are you listening outside the door? I'd hope that they would say the same, that I'm usually quite good at saying when I'm cranky, but also feeling that level of shame when I had all sorts going on, young baby, working full time, but being in that mode of, I could really do without this person being off long-term sick, or why can't they just leave that at the door rather than this whole self being brought to work? And so I'm holding myself to account for that as well, that I didn't always get it right. But I think we are more used to apologising. And I'm really terrible at apologising, which is why I probably even struggle to say, yeah, I'd apologise. It's more about taking responsibility for me.
Yeah, I think I was looking at some articles on communication and women's voices being heard, and or why they are not heard as much as men's. And it was a psychologist who was writing the article. I can't remember the title now, but they were saying that we are, in a way, though, taught from a very young age. Society teaches women to be more flexible, pliable, that we're taught to be more apologetic. We're taught to say we're sorry, whereas men or boys are taught that saying sorry is a weakness. Because I do think that there is still this, in a lot of the leadership cultures is this idea that everything has to be gladiatorial, everything has to be a zero-sum game. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. And in order to be seen as a leader, the concept of a leader still holds very many masculine traits of strength and control and power. And I think that you talking about when you were younger, maybe being less empathetic to other people who were suffering and impacting on their work, it is a reflection of this patriarchal system that women had to buy into in order to succeed, or felt they had to at least. I certainly, when I was younger, a young officer, felt very proud to be viewed as one of the boys. And I did take a pride in that, and I tried very hard to be like the other male officers. And I was called to account on that by a very wise staff sergeant who one day came into the office and said, "Look, ma'am, you're a good leader. You're a good officer. It's not despite being a woman. You need to stop trying to follow the lead and be like the other male officers. Embrace the leadership that you have and be a good leader. Just be you as a leader rather than trying to be a guy as a leader." And that really did stick with me. And I've seen it reflected in so many places. People often say to me, "Oh God, the number of women bosses are awful. They're really mean and they're worse than the male bosses, particularly to women." And I do think that's a reflection of people feeling that they've had to work really hard. They've put up with all kinds of stuff and they don't see why it should be any easier for women. Rather than turning around and going, the culture has to change.
I also think with you articulating it like that, when I think about not recognizing other people's suffering, it's no good if you don't recognize your own. So being the quite senior person with a young child, trying to be this all-encompassing person, and not acknowledging that, often I also find one of the things that I learned in my coaching path was that often the thing that we judge others for is the thing that we don't want to look at ourselves in the mirror about. So somebody taking time away to care for themselves irritated the shit out of me. And I felt really resentful of it because I wasn't willing to ask for that. And the number of people I've worked with who, when you talk to them about self-care or speaking up for what they need or whatever it might be, women will go, "Yeah, but that's a bit selfish, isn't it?" I'm here to tell you, no, it's not. It really isn't. But I've been there myself, and a little bit of making sure that you are included in whatever that is stops the amount of suffering, I think, as much as I was going to say something else and it's completely gone out of my head. So now it's your turn.
Yay! Okay, I will run with that one. I think it's a really interesting concept that I hadn't really thought about so much, about recognizing my own suffering. And I guess it took me until I ended up having to take some time out of work because I was so burnt out. I was having anxiety attacks. There was an awful lot going on, as well as having to deal with having been in conflict zones and worrying about whether people were going to live or die. I think, including myself. And I think it wasn't until I just got to a point where I think my husband actually just said, "I'm going to take you to the doctor because you are not well." And that was a huge sort of mixed feelings because one, it was a huge sense of relief because someone else gave me permission. And I didn't feel I could ask for it, but also a huge sense of guilt because I felt I'm obviously not strong enough. I'm not enough in whatever. And, there's a huge big slap of humility as well to just, why on earth would you leave it so long that you end up having to be on medication and not being able to go to work, and still going through feelings of guilt because other people are having to get on with all kinds of things. I think it's happened to a lot of women that I know. Lots of women I know who have left, who have what people call burnt out, but I think it just have got to a point where either they are burnt out or they can see it happening and make a choice. And once I went back to work, I made a choice and said, no, you know what? This isn't going to get better. This is just going to keep going on to stop.
Yeah, it's the fact that there has to be something near on catastrophic before we get, I always call it the porridge moment. So a friend of mine talked once about, and it often happens with people that you're coaching as well, that there becomes a break. There's some level of breakdown, not necessarily a nervous breakdown, but there's something happens that makes you go, whoa, hold on a minute. So the porridge moment for him was when he put porridge in a microwave and it exploded everywhere. And it was completely the last straw. But that was the moment that everything changed. And that's clearly what happened for you. There have been a number of those breaks in terms of losing my parents, different things. And I can't even pinpoint now with the coaching what it was, but it must have happened in that development that I was like, whoa, hang on a minute, what's actually gone on here? But that whole level of, I've seen a diagram before now, which has your performance looking like this, and this is how you can be perceived. But bodily, mentally, physically, emotionally, you are on a crash course down here somewhere. And I think that so it goes all the way back to the thing that you were talking about before about being one of the boys, rather than being a really good leader and despite being a girl.
Yeah.
I sometimes think that us girls are in that narrative, that even we say it for ourselves. Look at how well I've done, even though I'm a girl. I don't do that anymore, but I know that I have done.
Yeah.
And there's none of that despite being a girl. And again, we're talking about this being wider for everyone. I've also seen males in awful versions of burnout for exactly the same reason, that I've got to keep bringing in the money. I've got to look after the family. I've put myself in this position and they're on a crash course here. And so many of us, males and females, are not very good at asking for help.
And I think that's this issue about culture, leadership culture, that it's not just about changing leadership culture. It's not just about benefiting women. Men suffer too from these expectations and from this concept that, oh, this is just for the big boys. Anyone else can just go big, go home. All of these sort of ideas.
Man up.
Yeah, exactly. Which really, really annoys me. But this concept that somehow being human is a failure or is weakness, it's not for winners, is really, really
counterintuitive
for everybody. And just that example of where performance is looking good, but people are not doing well. But I noticed when I worked in the field in the UN that depending on the duty station, you normally have an R&R cycle if there's particular pressures and stresses. And some of them will be a 4-week cycle, some of them will be a 6-week cycle, some of them 8-week cycle, depending on the sort of perceived or the assessed stress and security risks. And I regularly came across people who were not taking that time, or would end up at the end of the year with loads of days that suddenly you're like, you have to take your day. Oh, I haven't got enough time to take all the days. So they haven't taken enough leave during the year, and they haven't taken this 1 week off every 4 weeks, for example. That is again seen as a little bit of a. Oh, I didn't take I know a superstar.
No, you're a twit.
Exactly. Because there's been an assessment of this situation that has decided that people need this time.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I didn't notice, and I tried to do, was to pay attention to how much leave and R&R my team were taking, and tell them they had to take leave.
Yeah.
You've now got X number of days accrued. You need to take it. I want to see you scheduling this. Why are you still here 6 weeks after your R&R cycle should have kicked in? Because there's pressure, because it's always an emergency, there's always a crisis, there's never enough people, that people feel that they're letting the side down somehow by going away and taking what is needed. I met leaders who would be like, they always take their R&R right on the dot. Good. Isn't that a good thing?
And that's when I'm back to the judgy about somebody doing something when you look in the mirror that you wouldn't do for yourself. And please don't think that I'm schooling you when I say this, but
school away.
But the ending up off sick.
Yeah.
Who's looking after them then? So that there is statutory holiday in companies, etc., for people to go and recharge their batteries for a reason. Because you let the side down a lot more when you have absolutely burnt yourself out. And you can't. And whilst a manager, I'm like you, I've gone through and gone, hang on a minute, we're halfway through the year and you've only taken this much. What's going on? Again, that's about knowing your people, because often some of them don't want to be at home.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
and I know that I've had people work for me who do feel more connection at work because they either live alone or whatever it might be. There is more contact and communication if they are in the workplace, and actually going off and being on leave and being by themselves is just horrific. So you have to work with that, but more often than not, the piece you're talking to is about the big ball culture of, hey, look at me, I don't need leave, I'm so cool. No, actually you're not.
Also the pressure.
You've got to alleviate that pressure. It goes back to what it is about communication.
Yeah. And I think we had two things come out from that, and I'll try and remember the second one while I'm talking about the first one. God, I've forgotten already. No, is this issue of more senior managers should be looking, if you've got high sickness rates amongst a particular team, then what's going on with the manager?
Absolutely.
And also looking at holidays, and HR should be paying attention to this and flagging it. Again, is this coming down because there's so much pressure, there's not enough staff, or there is something else going on? Is the leader, the immediate leader, doing something that doesn't make people feel safe to be able to take time off, or to turn around and say, I need a break?
Yeah.
Or I am overworked. And that comes down, people need to look in on themselves as leaders. Am I causing this?
Yeah.
Or is my boss causing this?
Yeah.
And then your role is to push back, right?
Yes.
It's to say, we don't have enough people, everyone is overworked, we're going to end up with a problem. We need to recruit more people, or we need more time, or we need more equipment, whatever it is that alleviates it, so that people have safe space to be able to go, yeah, I can go on leave without being made to feel that I'm somehow letting the side.
Yeah. No, I agree. I was also thinking about compassionate leave when there's been loss as well. I probably have not been the best of HR directors in my time, because I flipping hate policies, because they are restrictive. I like working in, or I would prefer to be working in, cultures where you have policies so that boundaries, but you can be fluid within it. And actually, sometimes when somebody's lost somebody, they ain't going to get it all sewn up and fine in a week.
Yeah.
And I want to be in a company where the manager has the power, or is empowered to go, I'm just going to work in the way that I need to with this person, because then they will come back. They will come back and there will be the give and take piece, because we have treated them really well and with the right amount of compassion as to what actually happens next. And I think that that's the levels of communication, rather than it being, I think you said right at the beginning about what you find and then think that you're lacking as a result of what you've read in a book. Whereas in fact, I think I've got to the point of, I read books and they leave so much out. It's not us. Do you know? Because the fact is that you can take a theory, but then what actually happens in practice? But you also, I mean, I'm just making a different segue now, but you were also talking to me about words and language and the things that we need to make sure of with our intention and what we're saying.
Yeah, so words are super powerful. I know that there's quite a lot of discussion about wokeness and political correctness, but I think that the most important thing is to recognize, to at least acknowledge, that words are powerful. They do impact on how people think and how people behave. They can impact on culture. And moaning about, oh, it's just crazy that we now have to say S/HE in documents, or we don't say chairman, now we say chair, or whatever we say now, chairperson. Political correctness gone mad. So actually, no, it's not, because it's really difficult to become things that you can't see or hear. And if all the documents always, or all the lectures or discussions always refer to a leader as a man, or never refer to any kind of diversity, then that diversity is not ever going to evolve. For example, I always used to change, if I was giving a talk or in meetings or in reports where it said men and women, I would always change it to women and men. And people would think I was being petty, And possibly I was.
Petulant, maybe.
Petulant, yeah, possibly I was, but I was trying to make a point.
Make a point, yep.
And even if it makes people stop and think as to why I might have done that, and then have their aha moment, or to roll their eyes and go, oh, there's the Bridget rampant feminazi, at least...
But it's a reaction.
Yeah. It brings about something. I have to say, I'm going to call you up on one thing.
Go on.
Girls, the use of girls in conversation, and it wasn't me, I can't claim ownership of this. We just recruited the first female armoured vehicle drivers in a particular location against a lot of pushback from a lot of male drivers. And everybody kept talking about them as girls. And she just came in and she was new and she just went, why are we infantilizing these women? They're adult women. All of them have children. All of them have degrees. And there's a whole load of men always going, oh, the girls this, the girls that. And I was doing it myself because I've always used girls. And we've used it, girls and boys, always. And so I was like, okay, you know what? That challenges my thinking a little bit. And so we had a meeting and I said, we're going to stop this. Words are powerful. These are women. They are as capable drivers as the men are proved to be more capable in some circumstances. And so we are going to stop using the word girls. And we all fall off the wagon every now and then because we've got into a habit. But it really made a difference to change the place of these women.
And the perception of it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so if you use that as an example, I apologise. And that brings us into this thing I think that we were talking about before, where if somebody doesn't know, ask questions or be receptive to being called up on changing their language. But how often would that have been well, piss off, I'll say what I like. Or the old style person might have just got really grumpy about it because I've been called up, especially when people are going to be listening to this. But that's not the case. But asking questions for understanding.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I have worked in as diverse organisations, communities as you have. So I often don't know what I don't know. So I ask. I know that my intentions are good. And I hope that the people I'm asking the questions of realise that too, because I want to be educated. I want to be better. I want to understand more. And that puts you in a vulnerable place because one, you are a leader going, and I think this is one of the most powerful things a leader can say is, I don't know. But how many don't do that because everybody else thinks that they should know? Well, they don't. So that's no good. So I don't know. I want to learn. I want to be an everyday learner. So I'm going to ask questions. Please don't be offended by my questions or my obtuseness because it's not meant to be that. It's something that I haven't experienced or haven't come across or whatever it might be. And I think that you were talking about wanting our allies, our male colleagues, to be in rooms and asking those questions. Yeah, I want that too. In which case we have to be there to give an invitation and to welcome them and to welcome the questions and to help them understand, rather than, as the words that you use, being a feminazi, being completely affronted that they don't know it already.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about allyship in another episode. But I think the point that I had made was the context of asking questions and the way they are asked is really important, because often women of colour, people of colour can be sick of quite intrusive questions that that in their experience have not necessarily come from a good place.
Yeah, you were saying about context.
But I do also think that we have to have the conversations. And so people are going to fuck up sometimes in terms of being insensitive or not realising the right context.
Or how they've asked it.
And if we want allies, we do need to create space for them and invite them to things. But I do think when there are meetings that have a particular focus on people who are less represented, my experience has often been, for example, when we're talking about gender, that there's a room full of women and the men don't come. And either that is, but you make the point that maybe they don't feel welcome, maybe they feel afraid, maybe they feel that they will be seen as idiots or will be attacked for some of the questions they ask. But I do think it's important that everyone is in the same room so that people understand, put themselves in the position, understand the trials that the people who are less well represented are experiencing, to understand how changes can be made. And my big message is, if you're a group of leaders and you're mainly men wanting to improve representation and retention of women, don't make decisions without there being women in the room.
No.
You have to ask women what it is they need, what they're experiencing, where we're going with this, what could we do, what can we do differently, what would make a difference to you, those sorts of questions. And then if someone has stepped out of their comfort zone and made themselves vulnerable to ask those questions,
be kind.
Then be kind, respond in the way, assume that it has come from a good place, even if maybe the way it's phrased doesn't sound like that. But I think that one of the tenets of nonviolent communication is assume that questions and statements come from a place of good or love. If it can be interpreted in two ways, interpret it in the good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we talk about messaging, to get those male colleagues into a room in the first place is very much about what the invite looks like.
Yeah.
And we're back to language again. Yeah. Because if it's all about, this is a group, entirely for women to talk about what they actually want,
it's off-putting.
Where's the invite?
Yeah.
So if it is going to be this collective, and I go all the way back, and I'm probably about to use the wrong wording, but the leadership qualities that we talked about when we were at Sandhurst all those 3 million years ago, but one of them was about mutual respect. And I think that's when the communication comes in, that if you can come at it to, and I think this is one of the non-violent communication pieces as well, about establishing common ground.
Yeah.
And so everyone needs to be in that conversation in order to find out where that common ground is without necessarily losing their own.
Yeah.
So it's respectful of where each is coming at it from, so that we can actually come to some level of compromise, or whatever word you actually want to use.
But also to develop the common ground, which is that this is going to improve life for everybody.
Yeah.
I think that one of the big issues with this discussions about feminism, and where feminism becomes a dirty word or people don't want to associate themselves as feminists, is this idea that somehow it's, as I said, to sort of battle this zero-sum game, that actually women's rights are human rights. If you change cultures to allow diversity and inclusion, actually it gives men a break from all these expectations that are fairly toxic, of you have to be the breadwinner, you have to be working all the hours, if you're not dedicated then you're not a winner. All this idea about winners and losers, and what's masculine and what's not masculine, what's a real man, what's not a real man. We need to strip all of those things away. And so any of the conversations about diversity and inclusion also help to strip away those things that are holding men in straitjackets and contribute to the horrific suicide levels of young men. It's win-win for everybody. And so the narrative needs to change from feminism for women to actually, let's change cultures to include everyone.
Yes. And I think you were saying earlier, and particularly about our age group, males in our age group, with that narrative that's gone on. Now, some of them perhaps didn't want to change the narrative in terms of being the person at home looking after the children, etc., etc. My husband and I had the conversation about him becoming a house husband when we had our daughter. And I'd never heard that come out of a male's mouth before. So even I was a bit like...
He's a very special man.
He's a very special man. And I was a bit like, what the hell are you talking about? But he was really in that mode. But I think that because of the narrative, there was little choice. And I think I said to you earlier as well, I also find with our demographic and potentially a little bit older, the number of people who've had to hide their sexuality. And when we start talking about societal norms and what lives in our tissues, there's been a hell of a lot going on in that. But I think we are now in a space, especially with us talking on podcasts and hopefully other people as well, where we're going, we can change the platform for everyone, not just for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's the important piece, is that we can culture change, and there's these societal norms. Really, that makes me tingle a little bit, this idea that it's in our skin, that that kind of sometimes makes me wonder how difficult it is to make those changes. But I also have heard you talk a lot about ripple effects, and I like the idea that even small changes can eventually cause bigger changes. And those sort of things are really important. I know I've had discussions with women about entering into politics, not me, I hasten to add.
Not yet.
No, thank you. I think that some women worry that going into politics, and like, maybe I won't be able to make the changes I wanted to make. But for me, I reassure people that just being there, just being another female face, is a start to a change, because until there are more female voices, until there is more representation, more diverse representation, then no change will happen. So yeah,
Absolutely.
you might not be the next Prime Minister of Ireland, but the fact that you
Have stepped
been
forward.
elected and are a face that is seen, so that there are more women's faces and more women's voices,
Makes a difference. Absolutely. If we go all the way back to trailblazing, we didn't know that we were doing it at the time, but we were making a difference.
Look at the difference between how women, what women can do in the military
now compared to then.
What we could do.
Yeah.
Blue eyeshadow and
oh, don't forget your lipstick with your cam cream. God's sake. Shall we finish with a quote?
Yes, let's go with that.
So I found this quote from George Bernard Shaw. If we're talking about communication, he says, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I think we can just leave it there. Thanks for listening and joining me on this little trip down memory lane. There will be more Being Reflective next week, where we look at another episode, so join us then. And until next time, take care and keep leading with heart.